Sergey's here. I just want to see. Okay, the link looks okay. I see Puya. I see Sergey. I see Sarah. All of my favorite people.
Hello, Dominique. Hello, everyone.
How's everybody doing?
We still alive?
Yeah, that's kind of the vibe of the first week. Like, still hanging on. Even for me, it's kind of weird because I'm kind of still in both mods. I'm kind of doing Rail and kind of doing JavaScript and kind of doing Sinatra because that's the assessment that I tend to give the most. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that I can move you guys over. We'll give everybody a second to hop in here. Let me move you guys. Hey, Wendy, I don't think we've met.
Hi, I was just about to send you a message asking if I could sit in on this. I'm in the full-time online program.
Sure, that's totally fine.
Oh, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, I just check in because we do get students who kind of accidentally end up in the wrong one, but you're totally able to stay. That's fine.
Okay, I won't be disruptive at all.
I wasn't worried, but and you're welcome to ask questions and whatnot. That all is fine.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Who did we just get? Hey, Trisha, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Doing okay. I'm excited for you and your assessment tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous, but yeah.
Yes, cool. All right, we're gonna get started just to respect everybody's time. We'll probably get people flowing in, right? So basically for us, we're on day 2 of JS, even though many of you feel like you're still trying to escape from Rails. And this is our first study group on JavaScript, specifically on manipulating the DOM, which we'll talk all about in just a sec, right? But one thing I want to stress to you guys is that JavaScript is kind of, let's call it a quirky language, right? There's a online book called You Don't Know JS that sums this up really well. And he says, like, JavaScript is nice because the barrier to entry is very low. It's easy to get started with JavaScript, but JavaScript can be very hard to master because it has a lot of little nuances and quirks. It actually was invented in 10 days, right? Which is super amazing, right? But you'll see some of these quirks, especially as you translate or like transition from Ruby to JavaScript. JavaScript's not always as user-friendly, and you're gonna find that you trip up on little things that are similar, but not quite the same. Just like any of you who speak more than one language, you might find that like sometimes it's helpful when the two languages are the same, but sometimes like you get bit by small differences. So what I want you to repeat to yourself as you're going through Mod 4 every day is JavaScript is fun. JavaScript is fun. Tell yourself that as often as you need to remember it, like to remember it and instill it, because it is going to drive you crazy sometimes. It's kind of like I think I told Sergey this metaphor before, but if Ruby is like your older child who always wants to make you happy and do the right thing, but they're just not that popular, JavaScript is like their younger sibling who's super popular, but they're kind of quirky, they get into trouble, they make you want to tear your hair out. So I'm working on that metaphor, but that's how I feel about JavaScript sometimes. So just remind yourself, JavaScript is fun and you'll be happy people, right? Now, in terms of what JavaScript is, right, it's hard to disentangle JavaScript from the DOM. So can anyone tell me what the DOM is? I actually hate that it is the same as my name because I hear more than my fair share of jokes about the DOM, right? But anyone know what the DOM is?
It's kind of hard to explain. Like,
It is.
I think it's like, I was reading something like the document, something.
Yeah. So the
but it's kind of hard to explain.
Yeah, it can be hard to explain, right? So Thomas, we're just talking about what the DOM is. We're trying to define it. So the acronym is Document Object Model, which is easy enough to remember, but it can be hard to kind of wrap your head around. But it's literally a model or a representation of what we call the document object, which basically is your HTML file, right? So it's a representation of what you're seeing on the page in the browser, right? And the whole point of JavaScript, at least initially, was how do we get at that so that we can manipulate it dynamically, right? So a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about JavaScript is how do we alter that representation so that we can change what we're viewing in the browser. in a programmatic way. So like, whereas previously in Rails, like, let's give an example. Say you have some kind of a view where you've got a post and you let users comment on your posts, right? You might have a little form where they make a comment, right? And now you have a new one, but what do you have to do so that you actually see that comment displayed on the page in Rails, as far as we know? Maybe it's not an obvious question, but you would have to refresh the page, right? Say you're doing something like redirecting back to that index, which is kind of a pain, right? And I've had more than one of you say like, I really wish I could do this without like having to update the page. That's half of what JavaScript is for, right? To get that altering of what you're seeing without a page refresh. So that's kind of the point of JavaScript, right? So unlike before where you had to re-render a page, now in JavaScript, we'll see you just change the DOM and what you're seeing on the page changes instantly, right? And going forward in your Mod 4 project and your Mod 5 project, you'll be building what we call SPAs or SPAs, single page applications. So not separate views, but one view that we render and then we change programmatically with JavaScript. One thing before I forget, because the JavaScript team is super serious about this. You probably don't have this extension installed, but if you do, there's an extension called Live Server. I don't have it installed because I don't use it. What it does is it basically like, it launches a local dev server and does live reloading, so it constantly refreshes the page. If you have this installed, you must disable it for your Mod 4 and 5 project. The team is pretty serious about that. It's also going to like drive you crazy as you're working with JavaScript. So if by chance you do have that installed, just make sure that you disable it, particularly for that Mod 4 and 5 assessment. Just a heads up. Cool. So turn that off if you have it on, right? Now let's talk about the DOM. The DOM in computer science is what we call a tree, right? So it's basically a data structure, right? It's a way of showing elements, what we're often going to call nodes, in a hierarchical way, right? So it's kind of like an upside down tree where you have this main parent node or element that sometimes we call the root, but then it branches off into what we call children, child nodes or child elements, right? That are all at the same level. And then we would call those siblings because they are at the same level, right? And then each of those could branch off and have their own children and so on and so forth, right? So that's what we're getting at when we talk about the DOM as a tree, right? You'll often see it modeled this way as well. It's the same idea. You've got a parent node. It's got children that are siblings, right? We've got a child of this one that's got its own child, right? Similarly, we've got a child with two of its own children that are siblings. No children here. Then we get two children that are siblings, right? Does that make sense as a concept? Right? Because often a lot of what we're doing with JavaScript is what we call traversing the DOM or navigating through that DOM to find whatever it is we're looking for because we want to alter it or remove it or add something else there, like give it a child node, right? We're just talking about it in the concept of HTML, right? So again, that DOM is a representation of your HTML file, right? But here, when we think of parents, we're thinking of like a body tag. It can have children, right? And each of those children can have their own children that are siblings and so on and so forth. They can branch off. So that's the kind of concept that we're getting at. Right. Any questions on that part, the DOM as a tree, right? But when we think about HTML, we kind of have a sideways tree, as we'll see in a second. Cool, right? So here's some HTML, super simple, right? The root node here is something called the document, right? It represents this page, my HTML file, right? It's got a child node of our HTML element, right? That then has its own two children, right? It's got a head element and a body element, right? And then each of those has their own children. So again, it's like you're thinking of that tree being on its side, right? Now, you may or may not have this. I have this extension. I think it's just called Open in Browser. There's like a number of different ways to open an HTML file in your browser. It seems like a simple thing, and it is. There's just a lot of ways that you can do it. I have this extension installed. If you don't, you can go ahead and install it. But if you do have it, then you can just right click on that file and you can go to open in default browser or in other browsers as well. I know with Atom, you can like just right click without any of that stuff. I do know sometimes students with WSL for whatever reason have issues opening their index files sometimes. So if you do, just like yell at me or go to ask a question. We have a few different things that we'll try, right? But this is my page, right? It's entirely too bright and it's not otherwise very exciting, right? But it's a representation of my HTML, right? If I inspect this page, which I can do by right clicking or I can do Command Option I, right? When we talk about the DOM, this is what we're referring to, right? This is the representation of my document object, right? And a representation of my HTML file, right? If I change the HTML in this file, that representation changes, but not vice versa, right? So I can change this representation. Let me make this bigger, actually. Can I do that? Yeah, I can change the representation without changing the index.html file, if that makes sense. Because that's kind of the point. We want to change what's actually being viewed, right? Now, right, another thing that's also fun about JavaScript is really to kind of just dig in and start playing around. You can do JavaScript directly in the console here. So like if you're in a browser, you can play around with JavaScript. It's easy to get started, which is nice. Cool. We talked about the DOM. We have this open. Now, what are the kinds of things I want to be able to do, right? Really fundamentally, we're CRUDing HTML elements, right? I can read them, which in this context means I'm accessing them. I'm searching for a particular one, or I'm searching for a bunch that match a certain condition, right? And then I can update them or delete them or add to them as I want, right? So we're CRUDing stuff. There are probably, a billion is probably a light exaggeration, but there are many ways of doing this in JavaScript. It's just a matter of knowing what methods are available to you and kind of Googling anything else and going from there, right? Let's talk first about reading, right? Often we want to target a particular element. A really common method for doing that is called query selector, right? And then let me back up a step. Most of these methods get called on document, because remember, the document is the representation of this page, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this method called query selector. Actually, if I just reference the document, I should get a bunch of methods suggested to me, right? So some of these I've never used before, but query selector and query selector all, super common, right? And the whole idea here is that I'm going to give some piece of information to this method, right? And it's going to traverse the DOM and find the first node that meets that condition, right? There are a few different ways I can do that. The simplest way is just to give a name of an element. So here I could reference div. If I wanted to get an anchor tag, that's just A. If I wanted an H1, it's just H1. So for the most part, they're intuitive. It's just a matter of knowing what thing you're looking for. I'm going to store this in a constant. We'll talk more about this on, oh, I have to give it a name. In a constant called div. We'll talk more about this on Thursday, kind of the fundamentals of JavaScript, but this is one way of declaring variables in JavaScript so that they cannot be reassigned later. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of that stuff on Thursday's study group. But all I'm going to do is grab the first div from this page, which in theory, ooh, not this guy, right? Should be this div out here, right? So I could do that directly in the console. I'm just going to run my file here by going over to console and refreshing the page. And then I should have access to that node, right? So all I did was snatch it up. It's that outer node, right? So it's traversing the DOM and just grabbing the first one that matches that condition, right? And there's other ways I can do that too. So I can select things based on like CSS selectors, things like IDs, things like classes. I can use a combination of those as well. So you'll find sometimes this feels a lot like when you were trying to scrape, if you did that in your first project, which can be fun or a pain depending on what you're traversing. Here, I'm just gonna target the same div, but I'm gonna use the ID, right? Anyone remember how we specify an ID when we're using it as a selector? So an ID versus a class, maybe. I don't think I have a chat going. No. Well, if you didn't know, you could Google how to target an ID as a selector, but I'll tell you here, you use a hashtag. I get these mixed up all the time. I'm guessing. Yeah, thanks, Wendy. You could use a different method called get element by ID. That's also one that we could use to target. In this case, I was thinking more like using query selector, but actually passing the ID. But I'll show it that way too. I'm just going to call this one outer div, even though it is the same div. And I'm going to call that same method. But if I wanted to use an ID selector, I would use the hashtag and then the name of the actual ID. So this one's outer node, right? And then if I head back over and I run my file and I refer to outer div, right? I'm still grabbing it. But I totally could have done something like document get element. And you'll see, you'll misspell these all the time. By ID, and that should also work just fine. And then here I don't have to specify the hashtag because I'm only grabbing by IDs. Oh, it's just like Ruby. It doesn't know what you meant, right? So I'm calling it on document. But document, oh, it like auto-corrected a thing for me, I think. There we go. And then get. Cool, right? So yeah, you're right, Wendy, that it works that way as well, right? Now, so we saw an ID. You could also do like class, right? I think I went back and added a class in here. It's the same idea. I had one called example. It's like the same as doing it with query selector here, but you would use a period instead of the hashtag, right? Now, more commonly, you want to grab multiple elements that match the same condition. Like maybe you want to target all of the H1s on a page, right? A common method that we use for that is query selector all. So if I wanted to say grab all of the divs on this page, I'm still going to call that method on document. I'm just going to refer to this separate method, right? But the argument is still the same, some kind of selector that I want to use to target those elements. Right? And in this case, I'm going to grab just all the divs on that page. Right? If I head back and refresh, right, I actually get something called a node list. Right? We're going to talk about this at a couple different points. This is what we would call an array-like object, right? Obviously, in some ways, it looks like an array. And in JavaScript, arrays are more similar than dissimilar to what we've seen in Ruby, just sometimes the methods behave a little bit differently, but it's the same concept, right? A node list, though, is array-like. I can do some things with it, like I could do with a normal array. So for example, I could grab the first element, right? What I can't do is call array methods on it. So for example, let's take something that we know from Ruby, right? There's a Ruby method called push. There's also a JavaScript method called push. What I can't do is call that method, which is an array method, on this node list. So I can't do something like push something, right? You'll get this error that you'll become all too familiar with, that it is not a function. So JavaScript doesn't know what we're talking about here, right? So we'll talk a little bit later about how to turn that node list into an array in case you wanted to do some array stuff with it. That's something that we'll come back to. Cool, right? Now, I feel like I've stressed this to you guys before. If you're someone who comes to this program with virtually no web dev background, and you find that you're not comfortable with some of the common HTML elements, or even if you are, like, and you don't have anything memorized virtually, like you don't know all of the things, you can Google them, right? It's just a matter of knowing like what elements you have available to you. You can look up selectors. Each element has its own attributes on it. So for example, an image tag has a source attribute. It's just a matter of being aware of what those are so you know what's possible as far as manipulating those, right? So if you're someone who finds that you're less comfortable, you might find it helpful to go through something like a W3 schools on the common elements. Okay. One thing that we can do though is we can manipulate some style stuff on our elements. So one thing I'll do don't think it matters too much where I do it. I'm actually going to change some of the styling on my page. I'm going to target the body element on my page. Right. So again, calling that same method. Let's use query selector again. Right, and that's body because that's the name of that element. Right, and what I can do next is I can refer back to that. I've stored it in a variable. I'm going to target some of its styling. Specifically, I'm going to give it a background color. Let's see, spell this right. Color yellow. Right, just kind of a simple thing, but it's a thing that we can do. One thing that I haven't brought up that you might not have seen yet is that the conventions are different in JavaScript versus Ruby. In Ruby, well, it's kind of annoying in Ruby because in some cases we camel case and in some cases we snake case, but more often it's snake case. Whereas in JavaScript, the standard is that we're going to camel case. So we start one word, next one just starts with a capital letter. That's the convention in JavaScript. But back to what I was doing, which was changing this page, right? So it's just a little thing that you can do, right? Obviously, I haven't changed my HTML. I'm just changing the representation of the page, whether that's adding a new element or adding some styling, right? Now, knowing this, you can get up to some shenanigans, particularly with your friends who are less tech savvy. So one thing we can do, I had this up before, is it gonna look funky now? I think this should still work the way that I had it planned, right? But if you find that you're poking around in the DOM and there's something that you want to change. So like here, what I'm going to want to do is I want to change this text here. It actually took a lot of digging to find exactly what I wanted, but although here it was pretty easy. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to target this anchor tag by its element type and also its class. The only thing is that there are many anchor tags on this page that have that class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use query selector all. And query selector all. And I specifically, I'm going to combine selectors here. I want an anchor tag that also has a class of, I think it was JS title. Can you guys see this okay? I feel like it's terribly small. Cool. And this is actually going to give me a ton of stuff. Some of you guys, if you did scraping for your first project, you found that you can get what you want, but like more than you need, basically. I've poked around with this and I know that the one that I want is actually the second one on the page, I think. Yeah, right? So one thing I can do is I can alter the HTML here. There's a couple ways that I can do this. We have access to an inner HTML method and also an inner text method. I'm just going to add some text here, so I'm going to do it that way, but there's more than one way to do that. So I'm going to call a method called inner text, right? And I'm going to say, because I'm super mature, right? I can just change the representation on the page, right? So that's all. Right? I'm not changing my HTML. I'm just changing something about how it's being represented. So when we talk about the DOM, right, it's just the representation that we're seeing on the screen, right? It's obviously not changing what's in my HTML file, right? Does that distinction make sense? Because I think for me as a student, it took a while for that to click. Sorry, I think I interrupted you, Trish.
Oh, it does. This is cool though. This is very cool. It's like
obviously like being super immature, but you can like do a bunch of things. You can remove things. So I could have just said, I actually don't want that to do anything anymore, right? It doesn't exist, poof, right? So little simple things that you can do, but a lot of JavaScript revolves around doing those little things just for whatever our greater app purposes are. Cool, 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 cool. Now,
so can I share a really dumb way I use that?
Sure, I'm always open to ideas.
So I coach CrossFit and we use like a TV screen to show the workouts at the gym.
Okay.
So I'll sometimes go into the DOM and change the description, but it's not changed in the computer system. So people think they're coming for something. And then when they get there, they have something else on the screen. It's actually pretty fun.
Oh, man.
So you can trick people into working out more.
Yeah, and I know in like CrossFit, like the workouts all have names, so there are probably like
Yeah.
some names that are scarier than others. So you just make it something that's less intimidating.
Like people never want to run. So whenever you put like running in a workout, you keep it off of their like the app so they can't see it. But then when they come in, I type it right on the screen and then it's there.
I appreciate it. Shenanigans.
Exactly. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. What was my point? I had a point. Well, I was just doing that for fun. But my real point is that what I want to do here in my HTML is I want to add some images. We'll add a simple image first, and then we're going to add all of these dank memes. I don't know if that's a thing people say anymore. It sounds like something my middle schoolers would say, but we're sticking with it. But what I want to do is I want to target this P div here, and I want to add a little image element under it, right? There's a few steps involved with that. I have to target it in the first place, right? So reading that element, right? I have to create a new element that's going to be an image tag, right? We know an image tag has a source attribute, so I need to tell it what URL to point to, and then I need to get it onto the page. So there's actually a few different steps here. So I picked a super cute little image, right? This is a cute little dog. I'm going to add this to the page. That's my goal, right? So what I first need to do is to target this P tag in my container. Now, in theory, it's pretty easy because it's the only P on this page, but we're going to pretend like that's not the case. And I specifically want to target it as a child of this container, because that's often a common pattern that we have these divs that don't really do much. They're just an anchor so that we can easily get at whatever's in them, whether it's for styling or JavaScript stuff, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I'll call it container P. Call it back on my document, right? How could I target this P element? Right? What selectors could I use?
P.
I could use P, right? And that would be the easiest way. That would work on its own. What I'm going to say here, just to show that you guys, that it's a thing that you can do, I specifically want a P that's a child of that div with the, I think it's the ID of container. So if you ever want to combine them that way, ooh, my fly is open. Sorry. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to target this div with an ID of container. And this space here says that I'm looking for a child of it. We can combine things. So this would be like if I wanted something with this ID, I guess it would be the reverse. I would say something like I want a P with an ID of container. This is saying I want to find a P that is a child of some element that has that ID applied, right? So that's what I'm showing you here, how we can combine some selectors. So I'm going to do that first. I'm going to double check that that works. Right? So we've got that P. So we've got the element down. That's fairly easy, right? If we want to create new elements, probably the most common use case is the create element method, right? So the way I would use that is generally I'd store it in a variable so I can use it later. So I'm going to call it image, right? And again, this one I call on the document. I'm going to call a method called create element. And then I'm going to give it the name as a string of whatever element type I'm creating, right? So if I wanted to make a div, I would give it div. In this case, I'm going to give it image, right? Just so I actually get the image, right? Now, since I've stored that in a variable, I avoid having to write kind of like one line super ugly JavaScript. I can just say something like image.source, because that's an attribute on that image tag, and I can give it a source, right? In this case, I know exactly what I want, or I did. There we go, right? Just gonna give it the source, right? So I'll add that in, right? And then what's my next step? Right, I've got the image, it knows its source, right? How do I actually get it onto the page?
Append?
Yeah, I think append is the most common use case. There's also an append child if you specifically wanted to make a child element, but for a P tag, it doesn't have children. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, grab that P element that I had before. So I'm going to refer to it by name, container P, and I'm going to call append. and give it that image tag, right, that I've created, right? And we'll see this is a common pattern. You can also do things like string concatenate. We'll talk about that later, but this is probably a better pattern to follow overall. I'll show you the other way too, though. But now, in theory, if I've done everything just right, I get a dog, right? Any questions about any of the steps that I took there?
So, Dominic, I just going ahead of myself, but the other time I was trying to create a form, like probably about 6-7 fields, and there was a huge lines of code for like creating all this. Is there any faster way to do that, like creating like within a loop, or it's just the way it is? You have to like.
I imagine you can use something like a loop with it, or like a JavaScript method like for each or map. I mean, I would need a little bit more context. I would have to see kind of how you tried it, but probably. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. What's my next step? Okay, so my next example. We got the dog in here. That was fine. Great. And again, the majority of the time, right, when you're working with JavaScript, you're either manipulating the DOM, which is what we're talking about here, or you're doing things with events, which we'll talk about later, right? So you'll do things like adding event listeners, right? Telling an element to listen for something to happen. That could be something like on click. So I've got a P tag that if I click on it, this other thing should occur. Or I've got an image. So like this isn't with JavaScript, this is with CSS. But when I hover on this element, we see that the sizing changes. That's actually done in the CSS, right? I've got a hover on there, but I could do it with JavaScript. So part of JavaScript is telling elements to listen for certain events and then responding to those events. So we'd say adding event listeners and then responding to the events when they happen, right? So generally that's what we're doing with JavaScript for front-end stuff, really. You can use JavaScript for back-end stuff. It's just generally used for front-end for those three cases. Let's talk a little bit more about adding events first. What I'm gonna do, since I have this image, right, I'll just give a simple example because it's easy to test out, and you'll see, you'll run yourself in circles with your event listeners and whether or not they're firing. So what I like to do, right, I'm gonna take this image and I'm gonna add a click event to it. So when I click on it, I want something to happen. I'm actually calling it image. And then I have an event I have access to called add event listener, right? So I'm telling this node to listen for a specific thing to happen. One way to do this is to give an argument of the event type. There are many different kinds of events that you can use. I think I have this popped up somewhere here. JavaScript events, right? It could be changing a form element, right? We'll do that a lot in React. It can be a mouse over. It can be on loading the page. There are a ton of different events that you can use. Most common is probably an on click. So when I click on this, right, what I'm gonna do here is I'm going to pass in a function, right, that I want to be called when I do that, right? If you're not really deep into JavaScript, the syntax is gonna be a little, I mean, obviously it's different from Ruby, right? But I'm defining a function, right? And similar to a Ruby method, it can take an argument. In this case, it doesn't. But what I want it specifically to do is do a little pop-up, right? Alert is a little method I can use that will give me a pop-up. My favorite pop-up is just to say boo, right? Because it's easy to get confirmation on whether the thing happened. So I'm gonna head back here and refresh, right? If I click on this, I would expect a little pop-up, right? So that would be an example of adding an event and responding to it, right? Just another thing that we can do in JavaScript, right? A nice way to get some feedback. So I did want to bring that up since I did mention event listeners, right? Now I want to go back to this concept of a node list in case you ever found it helpful, like, because you'll see that you can grab all of these nodes, but then you're like, I really wish I could iterate over that and do something, right? But I can't because it's not really an array. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to grab, what did I want here? I think I wanted, just the H1, right? There's only one of these here, so I don't have to do it this way, but I specifically want to show you a node list. So I'm going to use query selector all for this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get rid of this for right now, right? So in JavaScript, you can comment things out just like in Ruby. Same keyboard shortcuts. So like for me, I do command and then the question mark. For JavaScript, we kind of get like, this is a symbol we use at Flatiron. We use it because it's the JavaScript thing, but that's how you would do a JavaScript comment. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to call this H1 array, or I guess I should call it array like object, but for argument purpose, we're just going to call it H1 array. So I can say document dot query selector all, and I specifically want, I guess I could just get H1, doesn't matter too much. But I know that this H1 is a child of that outer node div, so I'm just going to grab it that way. Outer node, specifically a child that's an H1, right? And then I see when I access that, what did I call it? H1 array. Cool. I get a node list. It's just got the one thing in it though, right? A nifty method that you can use if you want to take a node list and convert it into an array is the array from method. There's a lot that you can do with this in addition to what I'm showing you here, but the simplest use case is you give it some item and it will turn it into an array, because then you can call whatever array methods you like on it. So we would just do I want to do it this way? I guess it doesn't matter too much. I'll do it in the browser. So I can say new array dot from, and then give it that H1 array, right? And now I get an actual array that I can do array stuff with. Yeah. So what you'll see if you haven't already, because it's kind of like they restructured the JavaScript curriculum since I was a student, and it's kind of like they kind of throw you into some JavaScript stuff first, and then they show you some basics. So you might not have seen this yet, but you'll see that there are some methods in JavaScript that are very similar to ones that we know how to use in Ruby. Things like for each, which is analogous to each. Things like map, which is analogous to map. These are fairly new. I think they came in with either ES5 or ES6, which were like later editions of JavaScript, because JavaScript has evolved to be a little bit more user-friendly. So we have some newer features and methods. But one thing we could do, since I have an array here, is I could say something like, go through that array, iterate, and I'm going to call this method called for each, right? That's a method I would use if I don't care what's returned, just like in the case of Ruby. But then what I could do, right, is I could pass it a function to execute on every item in that array, right? So in JavaScript, I use the function keyword. I'm going to give this an argument. This represents the current item in my array, right? So similar to like Ruby's pipes when you're using something like map or each. But I'm going to say for every item, one at a time, I'm going to just console.log it, because I can do something with it, right? Console.log is analogous to something like a Ruby prints or put, right? It's just a way of getting something outputted, right? So I can call this, and all it's doing is outputting that URL. I can do other things with it. Let's say, for example, I wanted to remove an element, right? So I could say for each of those elements, in this case, just the one, I can remove it from the DOM, right? So I don't know if you saw, right? It's just going to get rid of that H1 because I cleared it. Cool, right? So just an example, I can remove things from the DOM as well, right? Any questions on that so far?
Did you turn that node list into an array? Is that what happened?
Yep.
Okay.
Because the thing is, let me slow down a bit. So like, this is the node list. What I can't do is something like I just did on that node list. I can't use array methods on a node list. So I can't do, what was I calling it? H1 array. I would have expected that I couldn't do that. I'm gonna have to think on that. But in theory, you'll find that like a lot of the more common array methods, you can't use them on node lists. So array from is a method that you could use to turn it into an array, right? So that's what I did there, right?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Another
So-
way,
I hate to. So a
You're good.
node list, when you change a node list to an array, it still acts like a node list? Or do you lose some functionality of whatever the node list does? That's because what you did it and that you changed it to an array, then you removed it, and then it removed it from the node list, right?
yeah. So
So
I
I'm
actually
trying
don't
to
know.
understand, why isn't it just an array? That's just what I'm trying to,
Got it.
does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. I'm actually not sure why I didn't get an error. So, because this should be a node list, and that works just fine. So if I refresh here, what did I call this? I just call it H1. All right, it definitely is a node list. And what I shouldn't be able to do is something like that. Ignore me for just a second. If I wanted to do something like, so like that doesn't work when I try to use an arrow function. Doesn't work with an arrow function. It says it's not a function. If I use normal function syntax, and some of this, like this is going to be gibberish if you haven't done any JavaScript before, but now I'm just poking around. But yeah, so this is what I was expecting previously when I tried calling for each on this, like it just doesn't respond to it. So that's why I had to coerce it into an array. As far as your question, Chris, I mean, I would imagine that we're using some or like losing some functionality from the node list, but I'm not actually sure. Like, I'm not sure what you would ultimately want to do with a node list versus accessing things from it or treating it like an array. So iterating through and doing something with each one. So I'm not entirely sure. Okay. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah, that was good.
we're gonna clear this. So we talked about removing things. We can also remove children. So one, which sounds violent if you don't have any context, but another thing that you have, I think I had a container element here, or at least I meant to grab it at some point. I just have the container P. So before I forget myself, I'm just going to grab the container div. So just a query selector again. Selector, and then I'm going to grab that ID of container. Because this container, it has a child of a P. So if you ever knew that you wanted to specifically target a child to remove it, which would be something like maybe you have a to-do list, right? And maybe they click on something because they've completed that to-do and you wanted to remove it from the list. That might be an example of targeting a child to remove it. You could do something like, why does this look ugly? Oh, you gotta give it a name, right? So this is my container. I'm gonna move this down here for clarity, right? So I've got my container div, right? I've got a method called remove child, and then in this case, I'll remove that container P, which I had already defined, right? So that should work, and I probably could just do this just as easily here. Oop, if I spelled it right, to refresh though. I guess I don't have to do it both ways, but it removed that element that was a child, right? So really the theme here is that there are a few different ways that we can CRUD elements in JavaScript, just showing you a couple of examples. Outside of that, you can kind of Google anything that you wanted to do, right? Now, what I ultimately wanted to do, right, is take all of these memes here, which I think they're all programming memes, and I want to append them to the DOM, right? So again, at a high level, what I want to do, right? Well, actually, let's step back because it's not as obvious to you guys. So I've got this array here that I've stored in another JavaScript file, right? Which I'm loading in my HTML along with my main JavaScript file, right? You'll see this is a pretty common like structure where you have a folder called source that has your JavaScript stuff, right? So I've got my main JavaScript file that I'm using to manipulate the DOM, but let's say I have some preloaded constants. I can do that from another file, so I'm not cluttering up my main file. What I want to do here is I'm going to iterate through this array, right? And then for each of these URLs, right, I'm going to make a new image. I'm going to tell it its source and then append it to the DOM, right? So that's my ultimate goal here, right? So it's going to be similar in flavor to what we did before with the dog one, right? So first, let me illustrate that I can access that, right? So I already have access to those memes, right, in my environment here, so to speak. So like we were talking about before, we have these nice array methods from ES6 or ES5 that are more user-friendly than what you had to do in JavaScript before, where you had to use a for loop or a while loop for just about everything, right? We have these nicer methods. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna iterate over the dank memes, and I'm gonna use that for each method again, which we said is analogous to each in Ruby. I'm gonna do it with an uglier syntax first. I'm gonna pass a function, right? In this case, an anonymous function, right? And then what I'm going to do, right, is I'm going to create a new image, right? The way that we did it before, we used that create element tag. I'm going to do the same thing here. So just constant, and we're going to call it new image tag, right? And call a method on our document, right? So that's just create element image, right? So you're kind of getting a sense of the flow here, right? So we made an image, right? And then what's our next step? We have the element.
You got to append it, right?
Well, I could do that. This is actually like a thing that students would commonly do, so it's actually valuable to do that. I could append it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to append it to, I thought I had this nested H1. What do I want to add it to? I want to add it to, I want to add it to here. So I just want to add it to that container P. So I'm going to target that first, right? So that's my container P, right? And then P's don't have children, so I'm just going to use append rather than append child, right? And that's going to be my new image tag, right? And that, in theory, should work. Let me make sure I'm adding it to the right place. I guess I could add it. It's kind of potato. Do I want to add it here or add it as a child here? They're equivalent for the sake of this example, so I'm not too worried about it. Now, in this case, right, you as a student would be like, I thought I added it to the DOM, and you would be right, except that I'm getting a syntax error. Container, create element. It's telling me about my parentheses making it angry. No, but that looks, oh. So if you don't have this already there, I think that the one that I used, I don't remember if it was VS Code or Atom, is Colorizer, but if you can get an extension to colorize your brackets and parentheses in your code editor, it's gonna make your life a lot easier. But basically I had a parenthesis in the wrong place, and now this I think should be good. So that's better. So I should have appended some images here, right? If I go through and, oh, I know what I did. I bit myself in the foot because I removed this P element before. Right? I don't want to do that anymore. I want it to still be there. Cool. So now when I look at the P element, I do have all of these image elements, right? They just don't do anything, right? So that would be a reasonable next step, Trisha. And I've helped students with this and ask the question. Appending is part of it, but also so that these actually display something, they're gonna need source attributes, right? So I totally could do this as kind of like, this is where I wanna end up, but then the in-between is I might wanna add some attributes. So in this case, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add an attribute, right, of whatever the current source is, right? So I haven't factored this in here. We saw an example previously. I can pass in an argument to this function that's going to represent the current item in my iteration. Again, similar to how with things like each and map in Ruby, you've got that block variable in pipes, right? It doesn't matter what I call this. I'm going to call it URL, right? But then what I'm going to do is for each of these new image tags I'm making, I'm going to set that source as whatever the current URL is, right? And that, I think, should work, right? I know that you guys have felt this one, right? You either know all of the things and you're super powerful, or you have no idea what's happening. This one looks like it's broken. This one is funny. They use coding and algorithms so the drones didn't crash. If going to crash, don't. So they're programmer memes, right? But we got them onto the page, right? Are there any questions about how we structured that? Right? Really, some of the syntax stuff we'll come back to on Thursday. Things like const versus let, things like, we'll probably, I don't know how much we'll get into arrow function stuff, but we can talk about it a little now. So basically, I think it might have been around when I was a student, but within the last few years, JavaScript has been updated with a few different features. One of the newer features is something called an arrow function, right? What I'm using here is not an arrow function. What an arrow function does that's special is it does something called binding this. This in JavaScript is analogous to what self is in Ruby, right? So an arrow function does something called binding this, which basically says that if I use that special syntax, it will bind this. So whatever I call that function on, it remembers that thing, right? This is the thing we're going to talk a ton about. It's one of those quirky things in JavaScript, but really all you need to know for now is that there are really two common syntaxes for writing functions in JavaScript. Right now we're using kind of the older school syntax, but more often than not, it's really easy to go from one to the other. And wherever possible, you want to be using arrow functions. Like modern JavaScript programmers do it that way. So looking at this function here, if I wanted to rewrite it, all I would do here is represent my argument in parentheses. They're optional if you only have one argument. They're not optional if you have more than one. But I'm going to give it the same name. And then I'm going to use this little arrow here. So this would be an example of an arrow function, which we'll talk more about later. But it should be functionally equivalent unless I broke something. We have things for each here. Should be, yeah, oh, because I'm not calling it the same thing, right? It's got to match the way that you're using it, right? Now I get my memes back here, right? So you kind of got a crash course in a number of things that we'll talk about here in JavaScript. Really, the main takeaways you should take from this are like that the DOM is the representation of the page. And the whole point of JavaScript is that we can manipulate it dynamically. So without a page refresh, right? There are a ton of methods that you can use to do that. I'll link you to like a number of different sources. This is actually kind of nifty. Most of these that we talked about, right? So there are some that are pretty common that seem to be almost the same. Like I didn't understand as a student how some of them were different. So if you're a little bit more advanced, you might find it helpful to look at some of the external resources that I'll link here. But really it's a matter of kind of knowing what is available to you and just playing around, right? JavaScript makes it really easy to poke around in the browser and see what's going on. And I think that was it. I guess the one thing that I could show you, this is also like equivalent to say using something like append. It's just, it often makes for code that's a little bit less clean and well organized. But one thing that you could do, right, is you can use the inner HTML method to add HTML directly. So like, let's say I get rid of what I'm doing here first. And let's say I just want to add one of those images. So what I'm going to do is I'm still going to target that. I guess I'll do the outer node here. And then I'll add just one specific image, but it kind of feels like hard coding. So I'll just do the whole thing here. That's fine. Document, query, selector, and I'll target outer node. Right. And we see it's kind of nice doing it this way too, because you get immediate feedback on whether it's doing what you want. I'm going to call this inner HTML method. You do have to have all of this capitalized or it will not work. And we see that it returns a string, right? Ultimately, everything on the internet is a string, right? But one thing I can do is something called concatenating, adding strings, and I can just kind of force in an HTML element. So here I'm going to make an image tag, right? But now it's kind of like I got to do the whole thing myself. So what I'm going to do, and actually I'll show you this too. So thinking in Ruby, when does it matter when you use single quotes versus double? I can only think of 2 times it matters in Ruby. Generally, it doesn't. When do you need to use 2 like double quotes in Ruby?
When we have a string with single quote, like apostrophe.
Like if it's nested, like a string inside of a string?
Yes.
That's one case. The other one is interpolating. In Ruby, you can't interpolate with single quotes, right? In JavaScript, you have single quotes and double quotes and something called, well, it's called a template literal, but it's when you use backticks, right? So you also have the option of using backticks in JavaScript to do what we call a template literal, which is the same concept as interpolating, right? If you're going to interpolate in JavaScript, you must use backticks, right? So I say that because I'm going to kind of force in the source here manually. In JavaScript, I do that with, oh no, sorry, my display is like doing a weird thing. I must be doing something. So that's the second time it's happened to me. So we're back here, but you're going to use brackets here, right? I'm going to close this. I'm going to finish off my image tag. That doesn't look quite right to me. Maybe I just have to finish it off. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over and just snatch one of those URLs, and that should work, I think. But then it's like something is off here with the formatting, missing bracket. Bam, bam, inner HTML. This is like, oh, because it's in the wrong place. So this is going to be a main quote. The template literal would have to be here after I end this bit here. Got it. There. It's got to be something small that I'm missing. Anyway, I'll come back to that later, but I'll just do it the easy way for now. So then we just won't. No, but that should totally work. If equals image, you've got the brace and the brace. It's something small that I'm missing. But in any case, like at the very least, you can add something like a simple element, right? And then I can see why doesn't it? It just doesn't like that one. But we're not even using that anymore. Okay, well, I got to the point, which is that you can add an element this way. In this case, it probably should have been a p tag, but inner HTML is a method that you can use, right? Any questions about like manipulating the DOM, updating, deleting? Okay. Really, you'll find that as you're transitioning into JS, it's not too bad. It can just be a little jarring that you don't get some of the basic stuff until after they're like, you have a bunch of lessons on doing things in the DOM. Then you get the fundamentals after that. It's also kind of a little tricky, as we said, switching from one language to another, but it's actually a useful skill too, because a lot of people who graduate our program, they get jobs even in things that we don't teach, right? Because really there are only so many things you can ask a computer to do, right? And they're not, like, they're more similar than dissimilar as you're going from one language to another. We're just showing you main concepts. And then if you ever needed to do the same thing in another language, you're just Googling, like, how do I do it in that language's syntax? So as you're transitioning from Ruby into JavaScript, just take heart that, like, I think everyone goes through the stages where they forget little things, or they're still in Ruby mode and they're transitioning. So like when you work with functions, probably the biggest thing is that you have to explicitly return in traditional functions in JavaScript rather than Ruby. So little things like that can be a little tricky. Right? Last call for questions, concerns, bad jokes, suggestions on how to trick your friends by manipulating the DOM. It's quite a bunch today. Also, hi, Norberto. We haven't met, but welcome to the cohort. Is there? He might not be able to speak now.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Last call. You'll see if, for those of you who aren't normally in my study groups, I have multiple last calls. I give you chances. Okay. How are you feeling about this stuff, Sergey?
It's new. I'm still
new.
great.
Yeah, for sure. How about you, Sarah?
It's kind of a review for me, so.
Okay. So Sarah will lead the study group next week. That's fine. Cool. All right. If you guys don't have any questions, I'm going to give you your time back because we're 2 minutes over. On Thursday, we're going to talk a bunch. Actually, let me, last thing. I thought, yeah. So on Thursday, we're going to talk about a lot of the funky, but also like really fundamental things about JavaScript that you often would get asked about in, say, a technical interview. And you should expect to be asked about in your Mod 4 assessment. I know it's kind of far away to think about that because you're still like recovering from the Mod 3 one or getting ready for it. But that's kind of going to be the content of Thursday's study group. What are some of the fundamental things? We'll talk about hoisting. We'll talk about some stuff related to scope and like different variable types. You'll see it's just a little bit quirky compared to Ruby. So that'll be the nature of what we talk about then. So that's something to look forward to. I'll see you guys then. You guys have a great night.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye.
Bye.